Hello, all. Welcome to Aspirant Study Circle. Today, let me pose you an uncomfortable question. We all know for sure that we cannot live without food. Hell, we even cannot live without our street food, our pani puris, our burgers, our fries, our you name it, right? In fact, how far can we even live without smartphones, without our vehicles, without our daily things that, for example, refrigerators, right? For example, the ACs. I mean, we cannot live without them. We are so dependent on them. And when we talk about smartphones, let me talk about the legend of the smartphones, which is Steve Jobs. So usually he writes to himself, he goes on into a process of introspection. So the crux of this message is his admiration for human species, because the level of innovations, the level that no one has ever experienced before. And Steve Jobs was able to appreciate that. He was able to appreciate his dependence on all the creations, all the innovations that have come before him. So now the question is, as much as we ought to be thankful to our awesome predecessors, we also need to think about our successors, our next generation. Are we stealing from the future generations based on our consumption patterns? That is one question everyone must ask for themselves. So, in a newspaper report by The Guardian, which claimed that capitalism is destroying the earth. Of course, capitalism is the foundation for all the innovation, all the technologies that we have before us today. And in fact, it calls as intergenerational theft. That means we are actually stealing from our future generations. That is the extent of our consumption. So, among all of this, what exactly is it for India? Now, before that, there is a data that actually is very interesting. So, when you look at the per capita energy consumption from nation to nation, India consumes about 18 kilowatt hour. Now, for comparison, assume a bulb. A bulb is about 60 watts, meaning 0.06 kilowatt hour. That means an average Indian consumes 300 bulbs, the energy of 300 bulbs a day, right? So that amounts to 18 kilowatt hour. This is for the average Indian that we are talking about. And when you talk about China, on the other hand, which is having such a huge population of the same level, 77 kilowatt hour. And you go beyond that, Germany, about 100 plus kilowatt hour. And the big boss, the United States of America, which consumes about 200 plus, around 200 kilowatt hour per capita energy consumption per day. We are talking about per day. So this is the extent of the disparity between developed and developing nations, between the North and the South. Also, we need to keep in mind the differences between urban and also the rural divide. So these are all interesting questions. And amongst all of this, we have a push towards sustainable development, towards clean energy. So if you talk about India's commitments, we know that India has achieved tremendously based on its commitments in Paris. For example, it has been able to reduce its energy intensity by 21%, right? 21% below the 2005 levels by 2014. And its goal or its aim was about 33 to 35%. And similarly, if we talk about the Panchamrit at COP, Conference of Parties 26, the highlight of that COP was the net zero emissions. And India intends to achieve net zero emissions by 2070. So all of this information is to give us a context of how we are to run towards, or how we are to chase energy, right? Because we all need energy, despite it being from renewable or fossil or in any manner. We need energy to thrive as humanity. That has been well established till now. And in fact, no other better example than Steve Jobs himself. the father of innovation of recent modern times. So for all of this, recently our Prime Minister Modi had given a call for Atmanirbhar, energy Atmanirbhar by 2040. On similar lines of Atmanirbhar Bharat, which was announced post-COVID, now there is energy Atmanirbhar. Now, what exactly is energy Atmanirbhar and how exactly do we get to energy Atmanirbhar or self-reliance? So what is the importance? So the importance on a large scale would be strategic autonomy. So from international relations point of view, strategic autonomy would be the less India is dependent on other nations for its energy requirements, the more the freedom it will have in making decisions in the international arena. That is point number one. Now, point number two is we do need fossil fuels. For instance, even if you take America, it had taken 4 decades for it to transition from coal-based electricity to purely electric, coal-based, steam-based energy production to electric energy. So this calls for question as to who are we comparing ourselves with? Because we have such a huge population, we have such developmental agendas, we need to remove poverty, we need to grow at the same time towards sustainable development. So all of these questions, even America took 4 decades. So there is a need to intensify domestic exploration with respect to energy. But there are 2 impending issues with respect to such a domestic exploration. For example, the infrastructure. Our infrastructure is not on par with international standards. And secondly, we have a complex geology. So when we have a complex geology, it is very difficult to say for sure that we will be able to mine resources. Now, the investment that goes into mining resources is huge. And because of our complex geology, we might not be always successful. And hence, it creates a commercial liability. And that is one of the reasons why the public sector units have a very poor track record, owing to many reasons, of course. So the solution lies in whether we privatize these public sector units or we entertain completely private sector units into exploration. So these are the questions in mind. Now, that was the second point. Now, let us move on to the third point, which is green battle. Now, Central Electricity Authority had forecast that wind and solar energy would accumulate to about 51% of installed generational capacity of about 830 gigawatts by 2030. So let me repeat, 51% of the installed energy capacity would come from solar and wind by 2030. But for this to happen, how can this be even possible without the building blocks of green energy? Now, what are the building blocks of green energy? Which is cobalt, copper, lithium, and semiconductor chips. See, these are very instrumental for electric vehicles, solar panels, and batteries. But there are impending issues. Now, for example, now we know the lithium triangle, which is Bolivia, Argentina, and Peru. And also we know that Chile and Peru, 38% of the copper production takes place in Chile and Peru. Now, these countries are actually, they are left-wing governments. And so they are very unreceptive towards private sector involvement. So we cannot really do anything much about this. And at the same time, we have China. And with respect to China, 47% of copper smelting and 42% of copper refining is done in China alone. So these calls into question about increasing, even if we move towards green energy, still we will be dependent just like we are dependent with respect to fossil fuels. So what exactly are the solution towards this? So experts like Rajesh Chadda and Ganesh Shivamani, they say that India has resources for cobalt, nickel, and rare heavy metals. But there needs to be no barriers with respect to domestic mining industries, because there are a lot of regulatory issues, there are a lot of financial issues. So there needs to be less barriers for such a domestic policy, of domestic mining policy. So that was point number 3. Now, the fourth point would be infrastructural development. See, due to Ukraine and Russia war, as we know, there has been tremendous crisis with respect to energy. The oil prices have been spiking up, and this creates a very volatile situation for the entire world. So there have been issues surrounding this. So despite sanctions, Europe in general and Germany in particular has no option but to buy oil from Russia, right? And this is one of the reasons is because Germany is not connected to this nearest grid, which is Spain, for the import of LNG. So now it had left itself to be vulnerable, and it is dependent on Russia. Now, we as a developing nation, India, we need to keep these things in mind. So now this can be seen in terms of weaponization of supply chain, because Russia holds the cards, because it knows that the Europe and the West is dependent on its oil, on its gas. So it can call the cards. So the solution would be, for example, for India, GAIL is investing in national gas grid pipeline. And at the same time, India needs to expand its strategic petroleum reserves, which can hold or which can have a cover of at least 30 days of consumption. So that would be point number 4. Now, moving on to point number 5, incentives. What exactly are green incentives? Now, incentives in the form of production-linked incentives, as we've seen post-COVID. Now, there are multiple benefits that the Indian government offers with respect to green infrastructure. But at the same time, we have to compare ourselves with the United States, the US Chips and Science Act, that has incentives in the form of subsidies, tax credits that are much, much larger than the incentives that are given to India, that are given by India in the form of production-linked incentives to its domestic green manufacturers. See, now the USA, it offers incentives to such a minute scale for different products, for example, for solar panels, for wind turbines, for batteries, for blue hydrogen. It has different setups, different policies for different sectors. So that is something we need to look into if we are to retain investors vis-a-vis the green infrastructure. Now that would become point number 5. Now the point number 6 is, see, we all know that much attention has been given to supply side crisis. Now, if there is any crisis with respect to supply, with respect to crude oil, that would have a very large impact on India. Even if you talk about inflation, the rupee depreciation, all such are offshoots of such a dependence on the supply. Now, have you ever thought about managing the demand side? Example, to give you a context, the Earth Hour Day, where you actually switch off for an hour. And that means you are actually trying to control your demand, right? So you're trying to control the demand. So when you do that, there would obviously be reduction in consumption. But the question is, as a developing and as a thriving and an aspiring nation, developing nation, can we actually afford a situation of demand side management? Now, that is a very big question. That would be point number 6. And point number 7 would be retraining and upskilling. See, as energy transition happens from fossil fuels to green energy, there is a need for less workforce for maintenance of, let's say, oil rigs and more technicians on solar farms. So as the transition happens, we need to retrain the people, we need to upskill them. That becomes very important, because without a workforce, we cannot attain much. All of these policies would be for nothing. And next, and the last and the most important point would be energy diplomacy. Now, we all have seen multiple YouTube shorts, multiple conversations of our Ministry of External Affairs, Jaishankar ji. And despite pressures, India is in a position to follow its national interest, right? Despite sanctions on Iran and Russia, we are still able to procure our energy requirements from Iran and Russia. Let it be dealing with rupee, or let it be not having such sanctions impose conditions on us and having replies And that is because we are in a strong diplomatic position. So all of these are questions, and all of these have solutions with respect to energy self-reliance or Atmanirbhar energy. And I hope you have enjoyed this session. For any questions, please do comment in the comment section. Thank you.